Hi, today we will be discussing about Spring Boot's external configuration concept. I already explained this in one of the videos that we can actually configure the properties and place the properties in application properties file, and we can refer them in our service or control classes, right? I'm going to explain the code snippet, how it is going to be happen. You can see we can do it in two ways. External properties, external configuration allows you to inject the property values into your application from various sources, like you can also place properties in dot properties file or .ml files, right? Environment variables, command line arguments, you can consider anything. For example, in our application .properties file, we have two properties. One is application name, app.name, and app.version equal 1.0.0, application external config app. Now I want to read these properties into my application. How can I do that? You can do this way. When you create a controller class, you can see here we are going to use @value annotation. What is that @value annotation? It is an annotation which will bind the properties from the application properties file to your particular class file, whether it is a controller file or configuration file or component file, whatever it is. You can do like this. So you want to read these values in a controller, right? I'm going to mark as a app name as using @value annotation, and inside I'm going to read that property. What is the property name? App.name. You can see here in application properties file, app.name is given. It is the name of the property. So I want to read that property. So when I mention like this @value of inside quotations dollar square brackets app.name, so what it will do, at runtime automatically this will read that property from the property file, and it will assign that value, respective value. What is the value here? My external config app. That is the value of app.name, right? Property. So that property value will be binded here dynamically. So this is one method. Okay, this is one method. And what is other method? Other method is, let's say, imagine if there are many properties, you cannot use @value for each and every property, right? It is a kind of tedious coding style, right? So to avoid that, we have other option, @configuration properties. So this annotation is there. You see here, what is the annotation will do? It will map the complete properties to your POJO entity, right? So what I am going to create here, I am going to create some properties like acme.enabled equal to true, acme.remote address equal to 127.0.0.1, security, username, password. I have mentioned all these things, and I am going to create the same POJO acme properties.java with all these properties. Then what this annotation will do, this annotation will automatically bind all these properties directly to that POJO attributes. So that way it simplifies. You don't need to use the value @value annotation. So if you want to bind all the properties directly to any POJO or entity, you can use @configuration properties annotation. Or if you want to use specific properties in the code, you can directly use @value annotation. You can go ahead and use it without any issue. But the better approach is the second approach. You can go with the second approach, because you always as a coding standards and practices, we want to map the properties to some POJO or entity, right? We will always map these properties to any POJO or entity to make it object oriented programming, so that I can access these properties anywhere in other classes, and so that way you can directly, you can also use the properties are very less, you can also use @value annotation, depends on the requirement, right? And other thing, I want to discuss the same concept. I want to extend this concept a little bit. Spring Boot, there is another concept. What is that? Spring Boot cloud configuration. Okay, I'll tell you what is this cloud configuration. Generally, every time in real-time application, you cannot place the properties inside application.properties file, YAML file. You cannot hardcode them there, because If somebody access your code repository, they'll see your properties, right? So you may want to store the username details, password, credentials, or any other, some details. You want to encrypt them, you want to store somewhere else, some other repository, not your location. You want to store them in third party server, secure server, and you want to access those details at runtime when you are deploying your application. Maybe if that is your approach of deploying your application, if that is your architecture, then you can use this cloud configuration concept. So here it involves two parts. Implementing Spring Cloud configuration involves basically two main components. One is config server to centralize property management. Other thing is config client. So config server, it is the centralized, it is the main server which actually access the centralized property management. It accesses the remote repository, Git repository. Okay. And config client, it consumes those properties. Client means any service that is going to consume those properties. So here config server acts as an intermediate service to access the properties and to provide it to a client. So I'll explain you how we are going to code it. First you need to include Spring Cloud config server dependency. It is required because you are going to make a service as a config server. You have to first add the dependency here. Okay. And the server serves the configuration properties from backend repository like Git or SVN. And now what we have to do, we have to enable this main class using annotation @enable config server annotation. It is very important. So you need to include the dependency here. We have included Spring Cloud config server dependency. And other thing is enable config server. The annotation is also very important because we have to make this as a config server, not a config client. Config client is the one which consumes the properties. Config server, it accesses the properties from the repository, remote repository, and provide them to config client, right? And here you see these properties, configure the server point to give Git repository. So this is my Git repository. Inside Git repository I have placed this property file. And remember here, this property file is not inside my application. It is somewhere in the Git repository, some third party Git repository. It is not with the remember, the properties are not with application. We are not placing these properties inside application properties file of Spring Boot application. Rather, we are placing all these properties inside the Git repository, remote repository. Now, so this config server is ready. Now we have to create a config client which actually consumes the properties. For that, we need to add a dependency, Spring Cloud starter config, these dependencies. And other thing is, see, we have to create a bootstrap file. Inside bootstrap file, we have to provide the config server, we have to provide the config server URI, right? It is the endpoint where our config server is running. The client must connect to the server before its main application context starts. This requires bootstrap file which defaults the localhost 8888 if not specified. We need to specify the config server URI. So before the application is getting started, it has to connect the config server. Right? For that, we will create a bootstrap.properties file inside the client application. And now here, client code to access properties. How we are going to access? We can use @configuration properties annotation, or we can use @value annotation also. So this way it is accessing. You see. So the main thing here, how we are accessing the properties here, this bootstrap.properties file. Here we need to mention spring.cloud.config URI equal to our config server URI. What is this localhost .8888 port which endpoint service is running here? The config server. How this config server is accessing these properties? This is going to access these properties from the Git repository. Okay. Server configuration. Configure the server property. Okay, I want to correct one thing here. In the server, we actually configure the server to point to Git repository. You see here, cloud config server git URI, github.com. We mentioned the GitHub, right? We have to give the GitHub repository name where we are storing all these properties. So I forgot to explain this. So in the server, whenever you are specifying this cloud config concept, you need to specify config server URI and in the server configurations, in the server config server application properties file, you have to specify the remote repository URL. Otherwise, how would you know? How would your server know from where you have to fetch all these properties file, right? It is not possible. That is why you are required to specify the GitHub repository or a remote any remote repository, whether it is SVN, GitHub or Bitbucket, whatever the repository it is. You have to specify that path and specification there actually. And after the config client, inside the config client, bootstrap.properties file is important. You need to specify the server endpoint. That way it will access. Thank you for listening this video. Thank you all.